on every continent except for Antarctica. We know we're probably going to hear about that soon. Jimmy's main interests are playing duplicate bridge and reading. She likes books, newspapers, and in a desperate time, she'll take the side of a cereal box. Given her profession and hobbies, it was completely for her to decide to walk the 500 miles in Spain less than 2 months before she set out. Without further ado, here's Santiago to tell us about her adventure along the Camino del Santiago.
Has anyone been arrested?
Not yet. Did you see anyone suspicious? Right. You remain.
The invitation to share with you was really an adventure of a lifetime walking across. But before we talk about the Camino, I want to dispel any notion you might have that I'm actually a fit hiker. Nothing could be further from the truth. And in fact, my mom was so dismayed about me doing this that I periodically had to send live pictures to her. This is one of them that I sent from the trail. I did retire when I was 46, and that first 18 months was like an extended, wonderful vacation. I relocated to Austin, Texas, and spent a lot of time having fun. That was early 2015, but by the middle of 2016, I was feeling a little how I was going to feel the rest of my life in a meaningful way. At the same time, the topic of the Camino kept coming up. First in a movie starring Martin Sheen. I was at a travel club meeting, and a woman that was sitting next to me was about to depart to walk the Camino, and I had never heard of this before 2016. I'm single, and I went out on a blind date with a guy who had just returned from walking the Camino. So I started feeling like all these signs are pointing me in this direction. So in early July, I thought, I wonder if I can pull it off this year. And I researched and discovered that September is a really typically nice weather month to walk across Spain. So 7 weeks before my departure date, I booked my ticket to Spain, and I sunk deep into research and preparation mode. But what is the Camino? Let's start there. It does have the UNESCO World Heritage designation, and pilgrims have been walking from their homes to Camino de Santiago for over 1,000 years. In English, Camino de Santiago means the way of St. James. And St. James is supposedly interred in the cathedral in Santiago, Spain. 1,000 years ago, you didn't take a train to your starting point or fly to your starting point. Rather, you started walking from your home. And as people approached France and Spain, routes started to converge. They started all over, but they started consolidating down into more traveled routes as you approach Santiago. And in fact, today, 7 of those routes are still in active use. I walked on the French route, the Camino Frances. It's the most traveled route, and that's why I picked it. I wanted plenty of opportunities to eat and drink along the way. And that is the route that I have shown on this map in red. It's called the French way because you actually start in France, over the eastern border of Spain into France, in a small village called Saint-Jean-Pied-de-Port. And unfortunately for me, and I'll talk more about this soon, the very first day you start crossing the Pyrenees into Spain. It was really brutal. This red route is 500 miles long. To give you a sense for 500 miles, if you walked from Chicago to Buffalo, you would be walking 500 miles. If you could walk on water in a Camino miracle, you could walk from London to Geneva in 500 miles. So it's no trivial undertaking. The route that I took is in red, but you can see a few of the other routes on this map in peach. There's one that runs right along the north coast of Spain called the Norte route, or you could start in Portugal, directly south of Santiago. There's a peach route running out from Portugal called the Portuguese route. About 300,000 pilgrims do this adventure every year, and in 2016, I was one of them. That said, the majority, and I'll give you a few more statistics later, do start quite close to Santiago, their journey today. You need to do 100 kilometers or 60 odd miles to say you did a pilgrimage. And there's a village called Saria that's 101 kilometers away from Santiago. And it is actually a very popular part of the route to do. This picture, in fact, is of Saint-Jean-Pied-de-Port, my starting point in France. It was such a wonderful, festive atmosphere. People were so excited. Some people had planned years to do this. And I remember that city fondly as the last time my body, my clothes, and my sleeping bag were all simultaneously clean and not smelly. It was my last clean moment in 500 miles. Hypothetically, the Camino is open all year, and some occasionally people do it in the winter time. But practically speaking, most people start and end their journey sometime between April 15th and October 15th. I left the States on my international flight on August 27th with a return ticket for October 4th. I did go by myself, but as I'll discuss later, I was rarely alone. Okay, so most women, immediately your mind turns to what to pack, and that's what I'm going to talk about next. This picture is a very typical view from my camera of me walking the Camino, in that everyone's ahead of me. I was one of the slowest walkers on the Camino, but you can see that I could always see people. There's a pretty vivid red backpack in front of me, but you can see people staggered all along the route. So it's very safe. I was never alone. There's lots of advice about packing for such a voyage. There's a Pilgrim's forum where you can ask any question and it will be answered. But practically speaking, most of the frequently asked questions are already answered. I also watched a few YouTube videos, which were really helpful about what to pack for the Camino. But the consensus is your pack should weigh no more than 10% of your body weight, and it should be between 30 and 40 liters. And I have my backpack. This is what a 14-pound, 36-liter backpack looks like. I think people are surprised by how small it looks like. I will lift it up if I can. It's because you don't have to camp or cook. So you don't need like Appalachian Trail level gear. So for today's presentation, I did pack it with 14 pounds worth of stuff. So afterwards, if you want to see what a 14-pound backpack looks like, you can strap it on your back and do a little bit of a demo. My backpack alone weighs 3 pounds. So that meant I could only bring 11 pounds of stuff. And I had a kitchen scale and I was weighing everything. You know, I needed a first aid kit, extra clothes, toiletries, a rain jacket, camp shoes for when I wasn't wearing my hiking shoes. It's a lot of stuff. And I was so careful about paring down. And the first time after I thought this is the bare minimum I can take, my pack weighed 19 pounds. So I had to cull a quarter of the things that I thought were essential, and ended up having the outfit I was wearing in any given day, and then 2 extra shirts and 1 extra pair of pants in my backpack to give you a perspective about how light I was traveling. I even tore my guidebook into the 33 walking stages I would do and stapled each section together. And then as I went, I had the day's section in my pocket. And at the end of the day, I pitched it to eliminate weight from my backpack as I went. This is a picture of my Pilgrim's passport. You're actually required to have a passport to do the Camino. And you get stamps at every place you stay. You can also get them at churches or in cafes. And at the end of my Camino, I had to present this passport at the Pilgrim's office to get my certificate that I had done a pilgrimage. Additionally, you need a passport to stay in the hostels that support the pilgrims on their trail. Now, to me, it blows my mind that someone would voluntarily stay in a smelly, basic bunk room if you weren't walking the Camino. I can't believe I had to demonstrate that I was doing it. But this is really a great memento of my trip, and you can see how beautiful and individual the stamps are for the different places that I stayed. I'm going to share with you now a little bit of Camino lore. the wisdom of the Camino is the first third of your walk is for your body. So you're really probably not prepared to walk 500 miles when you start. So at first, you're just building up your stamina, building up your muscles, figuring out how everything works. The middle third is for your mind. It's called the Meseta, and it's very boring. I'll talk more about that later. But it's a time to ruminate on the things that maybe you came to the Camino to try to figure out. The last third, as you're approaching the cathedral and you're starting to get excited, is for your spirit. So this journey provides everything that a pilgrim could ask for: their body, their mind, and their spirit. Now I'm going to talk about that wretched first day crossing the Pyrenees. This picture is actually from the Pyrenees, and I am really actually glad I started there because it is just jaw-droppingly gorgeous. The Pyrenees are, from geological standards, an old mountain range. And as a result, there's no technical climbing I was doing. You know, there were paths that were, if you had aerobic stamina, relatively easy to traverse. In that first day, I needed to walk 15 miles to get to the monastery I was staying at that night. I ascended during the day 1,200 meters. To give you some perspective on that, the Eiffel Tower, the Empire State Building, and the John Hancock Building are 1,200 meters combined. So if you can imagine walking up all three of those buildings over the course of a day, that's what I had to do on my first day on the Camino. And then when I got to the top, I did have to descend 500 of those meters before arriving in the monastery. In September, the sun rises a little bit late. It rises at 8:30, and I wanted to walk in daylight. And so I took just a few comfort breaks during that first day, and it took me from 8:30 to 5 to walk that first 15 miles. Okay. This picture is of two of the symbols of the Camino. The first is the clamshell, and what a beautiful representation of what's happening on the Camino. People are starting from all different parts of the world, walking their own journey, and then converging at the end of the clamshell in one place in Santiago. The other symbol of the Camino is a yellow arrow. And between these two symbols, this is actually a really nice trail marker. Most of them are spray painted arrows on rocks or trees. When you're in a town, which you do go through occasionally, they have the clamshell pattern in bronze in the sidewalk. So I rarely got lost. It's very difficult to get lost. But when I did, it was usually in a city where there are people just going to lunch and running their errands and all this traffic. And I wouldn't realize I needed to turn because you have to look down at the sidewalk. So I would maybe go straight when I should have turned. But a Spanish person would, I was obviously a pilgrim, would grab me by the elbow, walk me back to the intersection I missed, and point me in the right direction. It was really wonderful. So I wasn't really prepared in any way to do the Camino, and an example of that is when I dropped to the bottom of the Pyrenees, I said to another woman in the hostel that night, "The worst day is behind us. We can do it now." And she kind of looked confused, and she said, "Well, that's true until the next mountain range." I was like, "There are more mountains." So in fact, I was not at that high point on my first day in the Pyrenees. That came later in the trip, a few weeks later. The high point is actually 1,530 meters. But by mountain standards, that's not tall. So to give you some perspective, Kilimanjaro and Denali are both around 6,000 meters. So these are really modest mountains and not technical crossings. Again, I went by myself, but I could always see people around me, lots of chatting, good times, so no safety worries. Yes?
How was your Spanish at the time?
I took 2 years of high school Spanish, a few moons before my trip. So the language, and I'll talk a little bit more about this later, but obviously the primary language is Spanish, but the secondary is English because people are coming from all over the world. So that's the second most common way. You know, the people running the hostels knew English. Yeah. It was mostly villages. But I passed through a city about once a week, which was great because you could reprovision there. Also, if you needed a rest day, it was a great place to do some tourism. The 4 cities I passed through were Pamplona, Logroño, Burgos, which is a cathedral city, and Leon. In fact, there's a Leon or a Leon in almost every European country because it's where the Roman legions were headquartered for that country. That was a really great place to tour. I didn't have to worry my entire trip about food, water, or shelter, which was wonderful. I just carried a half-liter water bottle with me. So more about that in the future slide. This is where I stayed. I stayed in hostels. In Spanish, they're called albergues. There are 3 types. The most common is a private albergue, but there were lots of religious places to stay, monasteries and convents that were oftentimes still working, but had bunk rooms for pilgrims. And then lastly, the dreaded municipal. If there was nowhere else around, they do want pilgrims going through. So a city would put one up and they were really a little bit dicey. But the cost was about $10 a night for a bunk. I personally love the private albergues because upgrades were available. So you might be able to pay an extra euro to secure a bottom bunk, the coveted bottom bunks. Laundry was really inexpensive if they offered it. They would do all of your clothes, all of your possessions in your backpack for about 3 euros. Maybe breakfast would be an option. But generally it was about $10 a night to stay in an albergue. Even though I like upgrades available at the private hostels, the monasteries did provide some of the more special experiences, and I'll be talking about one of those soon. They're super, super basic. They have a room might have between 4 and 50 bunks in it. They're mixed gender, and I saw every body part over the course of my journey. It's not a place for modesty. Just occasionally, bunks would even be 3 high.
Wow.
So I never had to stay in the top ones, but yeah, they really have you packed in there. They have showers, but it's really tight quarters, not built for comfort. And there's no climate control, not even a fan. So the high temperatures in September were supposed to be around 75, but it was one of those hot summers in Europe that happened. And for about 10 days, the temperatures were between 90 and 100. Even though I gave you the sense that maybe you had choices about where you stayed, this is rural Spain for the most part that you're walking through. So I often just had maybe one choice of where to stay. Okay. Now I'm going to talk about a typical day in a pilgrim's life. This picture is not what I'm about to tell you about, but just a picture of the Camino that I really love. These are ruins from probably about 1,000 years ago of a convent / hostel that was available to pilgrims that's now in ruins, but I walked right through it. It was right on the trail to support pilgrims. Ravenel was the high point, not emotionally, but geographically for me of the trip. It was 1,530 meters. Having crossed the Pyrenees, I was worried about this mountain. So I thought, I'm so smart, I'm so clever. I'm going to make this a short day. So that day I had planned to only walk 7 miles, and I was going to arrive at the monastery. I was staying in that night early to secure a bottom bunk. So I had my whole plan together. These monasteries and many places are incredibly efficiently run. Everything religious is run by volunteers. And so the volunteers at this monastery have it really dialed in. It opens at 1. In fact, most hostels close at 9 in the morning, you have to be out, and they reopen at 1, and they turn them over, they clean them for that 4 hours between. So I got in the 6th lawn chair. They have a line of lawn chairs if you got there early. I had a bunk, I'm not tired, this is gonna be awesome. And when it was my turn to check in, I had to do some questions because they log data, what was my nationality, what was my plan. And so when we were through with that, I said, gee, I really love a lower walk since I'm here early. And she said, oh, you know, we save those for the elderly and people who have been injured. Do you have any injuries? And I thought, I am feeling a little fragile. But over her head, there was, you know, a doorway with Christ on the crucifix. You had time to fit to get a lower down. So I took my upper bunk. But one of the questions they asked me as I checked in was whether I was feeling maybe any itching or bed bug symptoms.
Oh.
Because they were receiving travelers in that had stayed at one particular albergue, and they weren't sure which one it was that had bed bugs. But I was feeling fine. So while I was waiting in line, I ran into an Irish school teacher that I had seen maybe a week earlier, and she and I agreed, we'll get our showers, and then we'll meet back out in the courtyard and chat and catch up. So we got our showers, we were outside, and a young woman, like a 20-year-old, checked in, and she did have bed bugs. And we got to watch her be, that was our afternoon entertainment, was watching the extensive process they did to, right in public, right in the courtyard there, to strip her down and delouse her from the bed bugs. While we were watching the show, a really great couple from Ohio that we kept running into checked in, and they said, oh, ladies, you know, wait for us. Don't do anything fun without us. Yes, this village had a population of 60, so we weren't gonna go too crazy. But they showered and came out, and the husband said, you know, I'm gonna go find a bottle of wine, and then, you know, we can relax and enjoy each other's company. There was literally a shack that sold, you know, frequently, for, you know, deodorant, bandages, things like that. And so he got a bottle of wine, and he came back, and we all dumped out our water bottles. He refilled them with wine, and I thought, a miracle is happening. I went to dinner. All the dinners are at communal tables because there's just not enough room. But I went to dinner with these three people, and afterwards, that particular monastery hosts an evening Pilgrim's Mass. It's a chanted mass, and just the whole day was such a really special and wonderful experience. And there was food. This picture is of a place where the towns were too far apart. So an entrepreneur set up a camping, you know, camper and was selling things by the trail side. This is a very typical and nice view of stopping for a break. In fact, there are lots of ways to get food on the Camino. I might have put a granola bar in my bag the first day and never ate it the entire time. You really can't go more than about 5 miles without running into something like this. Additionally, all of the towns have what they call a bar, but it's really a cafe. And it's a really great business model because in the morning and afternoon, they sell things to pilgrims. And then in the evening, the townspeople use it as a bar and restaurant. So that was an option. Every single village that you stay in has a pilgrim's dinner. It's around $10, and it includes wine, your main dish, and dessert. I don't understand the economics of it because when I say wine, it isn't a glass of wine. They just plop wine bottles down the middle of the table, and you serve yourself as much as you would like. When I started walking the Camino, I was really anxious about my day and how long it was going to take me to walk that stage. I needed to average about 15 miles. And I felt like I was rushing it a little bit, and I was just exhausted all of the time. But I noticed, particularly the young people, they would actually be laying on the ground with their backpack as a pillow, just totally sacked out in the middle of the day. And I learned over time that I needed to take every opportunity to rest that I could. In fact, I even took my shoes and my socks off. My socks were getting wet, and that was causing blisters. So I aired my socks out, changed them if I needed to, had a snack, had a lot of snacks, restroom when possible. I only had to use what they call the green restroom, which is nature, twice in 5.5 weeks. So I was able generally to hit a restroom. People talk along the Camino about how much weight they're losing. You know, guys will say, oh, I had to tighten it up a notch on my belt and I'm losing all this weight. And I thought, I bet I am too. In fact, I had weighed myself before I left home because people talk about how much weight they lose. So I was really excited when I got home to weigh myself. And I discovered that in the course of 5.5 weeks of walking, I lost a -0.4 pounds. I'm maybe the only person who has ever walked 500 miles.
Put muscle on.
Okay, some more about pilgrims. This picture is from the nicest bunkhouse I stayed in. It was actually the monastery I stayed in at the bottom of the Pyrenees that very first night. I checked in so late that the only bunks available were on the top level of a three or four story building. And so there was no second level of bunks because you could see the dormers in the ceiling. It was misty in the Pyrenees, so we were all trying to dry out our clothes for the next day. That's all the clothes you see hanging out on the end of the bunks. But it was really a special night. More about pilgrims. About a week into my own pilgrimage, I sent an email home to some of my friends saying, I have blisters that I didn't know blisters could be this big. It's hotter than 80s here. I feel like I'm almost camping. I'm pretty sure I smell. There was kind of a wafting, odor around my backpack. And one of my good friends, Tim, wrote back and said, gosh, I'm so sorry your vacation isn't going well. It almost sounds like you're on a pilgrimage. And it was just such a wonderful reminder of what I was there trying to do, that suffering is a part of a pilgrimage. In fact, most pilgrims had stories about why they were doing their pilgrimage. Maybe they had survived a bout with cancer, or were celebrating the life of a loved one that had passed away. A few people were mid-career and maybe lost or chose to lose their jobs and were reevaluating what they wanted to do next. So I felt a little lame by just saying, I heard about it, bought a plane ticket and showed up. But these stories were really inspiring, and most pilgrims have a reason for doing their pilgrimage. Age-wise, 27% of pilgrims are under age 30. The majority were my age, age 30 to 60, that's over half. But 20%, 1 in 5, are over age 60. And in September, when school is back in session, most of the people are closer to my age. And I would tell you honestly that if you could go out today and walk 5 miles, you can walk the Camino. It is not a technical walk. It's just an endurance thing. It's just having the will to do it. I mentioned that I did 500 miles, or I had to cheat in the middle. I'll tell you more about that later. But my plan was to do 500 miles, and about 10% of the people do that. 28% start at the 101 kilometer mark away from Santiago. If you do that, there are 5 stages you walk. So most people that have a week's vacation do that choice. 42% of pilgrims are Spanish, followed by large numbers of German and Italian. In fact, I could always spot the Germans because they were relatively clean looking, zooming past you. And in fact, only 6% of pilgrims are American. So I met, maybe 20 Americans on the trip. But as we mentioned earlier, English is the language of the Camino, the secondary language, and rarely did I need help that the person did not speak English. The last thing I'd like to say about pilgrims before I move on is that you never say goodbye to a pilgrim you meet on the Camino, because if you think about it, we're all walking. So we're just doing this. You might take a different rest day from someone, or walk with someone in the morning and choose a different spot for lunch. You want to keep going a little further. But instead of saying goodbye, you say buen camino, which means have a good way, be good on your way. And in fact, if you just pass someone on a Camino, you say buen camino. And it's just really a lovely sentiment. This picture is a really beautiful old town, and that bridge you see is part of their original natural fortifications that they built. And in fact, this bridge is said to have inspired a scene in the book Don Quixote. But that's not what I want to talk about. I want to talk about pain and how much pain is in. There really is constant pain from walking 15 miles and then waking up the next day and doing it again. I felt it a lot in my knees. I was using trekking poles and it really helped take some weight off of your knees, but they hurt badly. And there's a drug that's now approved for the US, I see for it, called Voltaren. At the time, it was only Europe. And people, it was either sweat or Voltaren that you smelled in a lot of houses. Everyone was rubbing something, some body part. I also did use those trekking poles, and you're really using them to use your weight. So if you've seen those Nordic walkers that are really aggressively torquing down on the poles, you have to do that. So I looked a bit like a bricklayer. My hands, developed blisters and ultimately calluses. But the blisters on my feet were, amazingly large and scary. But there's medical, no matter what ails you, there's medical assistance all along the Camino. They have pharmacies. Here in our pharmacies, the bulk of the square footage is out in places you can get to. But in Europe, there's just a small vestibule where maybe you could buy lip balm and sunscreen. Everything else is behind the counter. And there's a window with a pharmacist. And I was a little nervous about this, but it ended up being such a blessing because they take their jobs very seriously. So I went and explained my blisters, and she gave me an antiseptic spray and told me how to treat them. So put gauze over the spray, tape it down. So it helped me get my feet in my shoes and, somewhat minimize the pain. By the way, I was mainlining Tylenol the entire time also. So that helped. And there are pharmacies everywhere. In fact, I was in a mountain pass and there were no buildings, but there was a pharmacy, a vending machine in a mountain pass. But I turned the corner on my blisters. I had to stop at an outfitter in the city to buy a replacement for something that broke. And she said, "How's your Camino?" And I said, "My feet are killing me." And she had me take off my trail runners and she looked at them and she said, "You don't have enough padding on the bottom." I thought, I don't think that's my problem, but they were heroes, so they were worth a try. I went back to my hostel, trimmed them for my shoes, popped out the insole that came with my trail runners, put those Dr. Scholl's gel inserts in, and I'll be darned if that did not solve the problem. And so right away, I knew it was going to be better. And about a week later, my blisters were mostly gone. Next, I want to talk about this concept of walking your own Camino. But first, I want to point out this picture. It's one of my favorites from the trip. I was leaving at daybreak from one of the cities called Logroño, and so you can see the sun rising with the church in the background. It's just beautiful. Around a week into my walk, I was in a town of about 5,000 people with a hotel, and the path ran right in front of the hotel. And someone was exiting, and as they were exiting, cold air came out of the hotel with them. And I walked another 10 steps, and then I thought, what's happening in there? I'm just curious about what's happening in that hotel. So I went in and rooms were only 50 euros. So I secured a room and then sort of embarrassingly slunk around the hotel for the rest of the night. Kind of feeling like I'd broken my covenant with what walking the Camino was. The next morning when I went down to the breakfast room, it was entirely populated with other pilgrims. And it was my first realization that some suffering is optional along the path. And certainly not every place had a town. So, I still needed to stay in quite a few albergues, but I started taking the chance every week 4 or 5 days to stay in a hotel when I could. Similarly, I ran into 2 Canadian women who were a riot. And one day I was saying how long the walk was that day, and they said, "Oh, you walked the whole way?" And I thought, what are my other options? They walked until they got tired, found the nearest road, and then called a cab and took a taxi, for the rest of the day. Because you really only have to walk that last 100 kilometers to get your certificate. Where I'm going with all of this, and then one other story. I did get off track because it was so hot. So I was really only doing 12 or 13 miles a day when I needed to be doing 15. So about halfway through my journey, I did take a bus jump. I jumped several stages to get back on track for my October 4th return ticket. But where I'm going with all of this is I needed to walk my own Camino. I shouldn't have been so worried about following rules that no one even had said anyway and were rather arbitrary. And isn't this a great metaphor for life, that we all just need to walk our own Camino, mind our own business, do what we need to do to optimize what's happening in our lives and not worry about what everyone else is doing. Okay, earlier I talked about that middle section of Meseta. Most of Spain is gorgeous. And in fact, this picture is from a part of the gorgeous part of Spain. This is an old lock and dam system on the stream. I don't know if you can see those really small old iron lock and dam. So most of it's beautiful. The Meseta is not. It is long, no trees, it's arid, really boring. But it really does give you time for reflection because there's not much to look at. I already mentioned a few aha moments during my trip. I definitely spent a lot of time realizing how lucky I was. Like what a problem I had to retire in my 40s and live in this great city I was living in and be able to travel around the world. Like for me, my life was perfect. And it really gave me an appreciation for how lucky I was. And that, so I was a little bored sometimes. I could fix that problem. The military, some branches of the military say you should embrace the suck. And what they mean by that is personal growth happens when you struggle and when you do hard things. And ever since then, if I've gone too long feeling comfortable, I know that I need to embrace some suck and do something really hard because I know I really grew a lot from having had this experience. I also realized I did live 5.5 weeks with just this backpack. And you don't need as much stuff as many of us Americans have. And in fact, happiness quickly devolved into just finding a bunk bed for the night and having a shower and a great meal with unlimited quantities of wine. Those were just a few things. There were more, but it really does. Have you ever been bored and your mind starts creatively wandering? And that's what happened in Meseta for me. At last, I arrived in Santiago after 5 weeks of walking. This picture, in fact, is the picture I took the first moment I realized I was seeing the cathedral. So in the shade, you can see backpackers in front of me, but in the distance, you can see the sun shining on one of the spires of the cathedral in Santiago. When I arrived, I did things like stand in an 1.5 hour long line with my Pilgrim's passport to prove I walked 100 kilometers. And I was asked some questions. It was really actually a fun experience. I was in line next to a newscaster from Chicago who walked the Portuguese route with his family. So it was just interesting to hear about a different route. I also toured the cathedral. Every day there's a pilgrim's mass for everyone who completed the walk the day before, and your name is said during the mass. And there was such a festive air there. It was such a nice bookend between starting in Saint-Jean-Pied-de-Port, same vibe, and then ending in Santiago. I stayed there. I got in at around noon. I had that day and the whole next day to sightsee. And I kept running into people who I met. One woman I met on the train ride from the airport to the starting point. Had not seen her again. And then I saw her in Santiago. So it was a great time to catch up with people I had been walking with for that 5 weeks. I will say that normal life did not feel normal for a long time. I would hear people complaining about something that felt trivial or even just driving a car, not kind of planning how I was going to get something done. Really, it was disorienting to come back to normal life. And by the way, when people say it's 500 miles, that's 500 miles on the trail. That's not trying to find your hostel for the night, maybe getting lost, taking your wrong turn, so going to dinner. So I was walking everywhere. In fact, I walked from the train station to St. John. When we got off the train, I thought, how do you get into town? Like, oh, walking. That's what I'm here to do, walking. I did do a series of pandemic projects to keep myself entertained, one of which was writing a book about walking the Camino. If you'd like to hear more about it, I would love it if you had the opportunity to read the book. I'm actually through Amazon able to make it free for 5 days a quarter, and I'm making it free starting starting today for the next 5 days because I don't want anyone to have to spend money if you'd like to hear more about the Camino. So it's free to download today for the next 5 days. And the last thing that I would like to share with you is that even though I call it a once in a lifetime trip, I have a college age niece who wants to do it. So she and I are going to do it together after her sophomore year is coming up late spring and early summer. Sherry, I know we're tight on time. Should we skip Q&A and go right to door prices? Okay, if anyone has a question, I'd be happy to answer it. Yes,
Was this some sort of co-sponsored by the Roman Catholic Church, or was it Greek Orthodox or Coptic? What religious group was predominant here?
Roman Catholic Church. They do survey people who did it at the end to ask what their motivations are when you get your certificate. And there are 5 choices. You can select more than one. So it's religious, cultural, fitness. I can't think off the top of my head what the others were, but about half of the people do it for religious reasons. And then there are people who like I really just sort of I literally just showed up. I'll see what this is all about. That said, I think you'd be hard pressed to meet a program that didn't end the journey saying that they didn't have a spiritual experience, however you define spirituality. Any other questions? Yes.
Are you going on the same trail with your niece?
That's a great question.
Or are you going to pick a different route?
I actually contemplated, the question is, am I going to do the same one with my 19, then 20-year-old niece? We're doing the same for a reason. I really like variety, but this is the most traveled and most supported route. So there were places to stay every 5 to 7 miles, lots of food, and it makes me nervous, particularly being responsible for her. And plus, this is the most popular, and I want her to have that experience. It will have been 6 years for me. So I'm ready to do it again, to see it again. Yes?
Did you have reservations every place or a target and knew sort of where you were going to stay?
Yeah, that's a great question. Every morning I would look at my stage map and it's sort of a choose your own adventure. Like, am I feeling like you can kind of say, okay, I could stay 7 miles from here, 13 or 18. Like, well, how am I feeling today? Some places take reservations. I'm totally ballparking here, but about 60% take reservations. Once I got started, I did not like going to a place and finding out it was full and having to walk, even if it was 200 meters. So I started doing rolling reservations. I thought, I think I know how I feel for the next 3 days. I'm feeling strong. So I would make plans and I just roll that. But that last 100 kilometers is really busy. So about 2 weeks before I arrived there, I made my last week's reservations when I could. Some albergues are like somebody's old ranch house where they made their son's bedroom into a 4-person bunk room. There's no reservation at a place like that. Yes.
Did you, to make the reservations, did you do it on your cell phone? Did you have cell phone coverage everywhere?
I did it on my cell phone. Wi-Fi is everywhere on the Camino. And even my Verizon plan had, just for Spain, $5 a day. But I use Wi-Fi and it's secure. Any other questions? Yes.
What was a typical diet?
I'm sorry, what was a typical
Diet. What
Diet.
Oh my gosh. A lot of wine. In the morning, yeah, wine. There was nothing more. In the morning, there's a great Spanish dish called the tortilla, but it's a potato casserole. I eat a lot of that. Sandwiches, baguettes, sandwiches. In the evening, it would be maybe an inexpensive cut of meat or pasta, something like that. But food is plentiful. I mean, I live candy bars. I wanted to support these businesses for my rest stops. So I'm like, a candy bar or croissant. In fact, there was a French guy in front of me and they had croissants and he took the last one. And I was kind of, I said, I can't believe I got you in my sight. So you took my croissant. About 5 days later, I ran into that Frenchman. Typical European fare, I would say. If that's how I know that's all. Yeah. And there's more in the book about the food. Okay, thank you so much.
Jenny, thank you for a wonderful presentation. Very entertaining and very enlightening for kind of understanding what that experience was like. I have a couple of announcements. Okay, first of all, does everyone have a ticket for the drawing? Okay, so keep your hand up until you get a ticket, and I'll go on with the announcements. Okay, the in-person meeting for WeGo is Wednesday, November 17th in Pickney Hall's May River Room at 10 o'clock. So Pickney Hall, May River Room, 10 o'clock on the 17th. Our next general membership meeting will be Tuesday, December 14th at 2 p.m. And we're going to be continuing our fall theme of exploring UNESCO World Heritage Sites. Our speaker is Dr. Rick Herrick, who lives here in Sun City. Dr. Herrick was a featured lecturer on a Viking cruise to the Holy Land 3 years ago, and will be presenting photos and sharing his experience in Jerusalem and the Holy Land. So we hope that each of you will be able to come and learn about his experiences. Also, as we said earlier, it's been a tradition to give more door prizes in December, and so we will be giving away $1,000 in door prizes, and you must be a member to win. So if you have, if you're a current member for 2021, you're good, but we hope that you'll join for 2022. And anyone who has joined for 2022 is also a member for the remainder of 2021. And the board has already said that we're going to do an in-person meeting for December, and it will be here in Hidden Cypress. So with that, I think we have our door prizes. We have one for Publix, one for Kroger, and one for Home Depot. They're all $25. And Jenny has given us 3 books. So each person who is whose name is drawn will also receive a book. So. Oh, this is someone, is Martina Giuliano on Zoom? No. I think I saw her name.
I don't see her now.
She's not there? No, okay, too bad. So, okay, the next ticket is 222074. Okay, in the back. Which gift card would you like? Home Depot, Publix, or Kroger? Okay, so, and Jenny, how about you? Okay, the number is 587975. Right up here in the corner. Okay. And here is
Kroger?
Kroger, okay.
Thank you.
There you go. Okay, and would you like to draw our last one, sir?
Oh, okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, the last number, 222071. Okay, we have our third winner. Thank you. Thank you all so much for coming today.